what's been going on in Tunisia, in Egypt and in other parts of the Arab world have not just, of course, been up front in the news, but also been very much in the interest of leftists and progressives and radicals there in that area, but all over the world. And I think there is a lot of interesting things going on there, and we can start to begin to see how the different interplay of international, regional and national factors are playing out in the struggles that are occurring, as we saw from what began as one, most of the media talks about the role of a particular person who set himself alight in protest against the poverty and the corruption that was facing Tunisia. Today we're talking about the possibility of the Mubarak regime, one of the most odious and hated brutal dictatorships on the brink of possibly falling, obviously depending as the protests continue there. Well, it was only about 10 or 12 years ago that we saw a similar wave, perhaps not as closely together, but of similar rebellions and protests occurring in Latin America. In 1999, we saw the first indigenous uprising in Ecuador that was able to bring down a government. In 2001, in the space of a week, something like 5 presidents were overthrown in Argentina. But today the focus of my talk is really looking at Bolivia, and what I wanted to try to do is looking at what has occurred over Bolivia since that time, since 2000 up until today, try and perhaps look at some key issues or questions or challenges that will also be, I think, just as relevant for the struggles that are occurring in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen as well today. And looking at perhaps what could potentially be some of the further hurdles or challenges that these revolts will face. So I think the first point I wanted to start off with is that there's no doubt that each country has its own specific conditions, its own characteristics, its own historic traditions, which all can interplay at a certain point in time and allow what begins as very small local struggles to very quickly become important national struggles, fighting against governments, as we have seen in Tunisia in the last month. In Bolivia, it was over a very simple issue. It was the issue of water, and that was in 2000, after the government had privatised Cochabamba's water supply, and local ratepayers had seen the cost of water increase by 400% in the space of a few months. The people of Cochabamba said, well, this is enough. We're not going to continue to take this. Came out, mobilised onto the streets, and within a month of mobilisations, the government had been forced to break its contract with Bechtel and essentially hand over the water to the communities in Cochabamba through the state-owned managed company to begin to control their water supplies. At the same time, about a month later, 2 other important struggles emerged in 2 other different parts of the country. One was actually almost on the opposite side of the country, in the Altiplano, in the indigenous highlands of Bolivia, where there was an important uprising by the Aymara indigenous people. Here, the key leader of that struggle was Felipe Quispe, and he very much, through the stance that him and his community took, and it was a very bold stance they took. They essentially said that we were sick of colonial white rule, and so they literally set up what they called a military quarters and burnt down all police stations, all military divisions, any building that belonged to the Bolivian state. Just razed them to the ground and said, we no longer accept your legitimacy. We now as indigenous people want to rule ourselves. And Felipe Quispe said something that was very important in that struggle, and he said that the only way we would agree to negotiate is president to president. Of course, everyone said, well, what do you mean president to president? And he said, well, you whites, US transnational interests, you have your president, or you will speak to our indigenous president, Felipe Quispe, as the head of that uprising, as equals. And for the first time in Bolivia, after 500 years of oppression, people began to think, in the majority indigenous population, well, actually, we should be equals. Well, we should be sitting at the table of equals. Why have we, continue to have these other people rule for us? At the exact same time as those protests in the Chapare region, which was sort of the heartland of the cocoa growers, there was also some important roadblocks there. And they're a very interesting mix, a historical mix of tin miners, who had traditionally been the sort of, really radical section of the workers' movement, but who, as a result of neoliberalism and the closure of the tin mines, had looked for work, and many of them had gone to the cocoa growing regions and brought with them that militant element of struggle. But also the fact that they had a very powerful symbol in the struggle, which was the coca leaf, which of course for the coca growers meant their livelihood. But for the indigenous peoples, it meant our right to be able to practice our own cultures and traditions free of any foreign interference. As they always said, well, coca is not cocaine. We're not in favour of cocaine, but why shouldn't we as indigenous people be able to practice our traditions, and in this case particularly the growing and chewing of the coca leaf. 3 years later, from what had begun as regional rebellions against specific issues, water, indigenous rights, defence of the coca leaf, we had in 2003 the gas war, where the issue of the fact that the government was going to attempt to sell Bolivia's gas, firstly to its, what is for many Bolivians a traditional enemy, in being Chile, in the sense that Chile had in war many years before taken off Bolivia's access to the sea. So the government was going to use the Chilean ports to get the gas out, and worse than that, for the Bolivian people, sell it at ridiculously low prices to the US market. And people said, well, this is enough, we're not going to take this anymore. And it was the first government that they would kick out in a 5-year period, 2003 to 2005. They would actually kick out one president and stop another two from being able to be sworn in order to bring in elections. But I think these three, as I said, separate struggles, with very little connection between them. But because of the issues that they raised and the specific characteristics of that country, an indigenous majority situation where many of the traditional militant elements of the workers' movement, particularly the tin miners, have been dispersed into other communities and brought with them their radical traditions of struggle. The fact that as a result of the decline of the workers' movement through neoliberalism and a growing indigenous pride that emerged amongst the peasant communities, saw these new social actors that began to emerge, local, regional level, but who were able to radiate their politics to across the country and actually start to change, what sort of people refer to as common sense. All of a sudden now it was common sense that indigenous people could say, we want to sit at the table as equals. All of a sudden it was common sense that we didn't have to have our water in the hands of transnational corporations. All of a sudden it was common sense that we should be able to practice our indigenous traditions and chew the coca leaf. Well, this emerging bloc also showed, I think, another specific characteristics of the struggle, not just in Bolivia, but I think everywhere in the world today. And that is that as inspiring and as exciting as rebellions can be, at the same time, they're not enough. As I said, in 2003, they were able to kick out the president, but in response, it was simply the vice president that filled the gap. It would take a year and a half for the social movements to once again come back out on the streets against the vice president they had, pledged to support once they got rid of the other president, to say, we now must get rid of you and stop the next two presidents from being able to be sworn in order to pave the way for elections. And each time that the social movements would rebel and kick out presidents but weren't able to directly take power into their own hands, what we saw was the old tactic of change a little bit in order to change nothing at all. And in fact, one of the famous military generals in Bolivia in the 19th century, Belzu, had been very prophetic in some ways in his treatment of the indigenous people. He was a military nationalist, what they refer to as a caudillo, like a real strong man. It was far from any interest that he had in democratic organising. But he understood that if you don't give indigenous people in Bolivia at least some elements of humanity and dignity, they will come back looking for revolution and will take whatever they must do in order to gain that level of dignity. Well, the people continue to rebel. They continue to want to fight for their dignity. And at the same time, we're able to do what I think is the third important point of the Bolivian struggle, and again, that I think will be important for the outcome of what occurs now in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Algeria, and many of the other struggles that are unfolding today. And that is the necessity to not just be clear on what we're against, but actually be able to put forward an alternative project for power. This was something actually that the peasant groups had clicked onto very early. In the mid-90s, they were already beginning to form their own political party. they had decided that given the governments were so subservient to the US and just continued to allow US military to come into the cocoa growing regions, bring in military troops to kill their own people, the cocoa growers and some of the other peasant groups will basically say, well look, there's no point just keeping protesting against bad laws. What we need to be are the ones that make the laws. If we're the ones making the laws, then the laws aren't going to go against us. So they began to build what is now today called the movement towards socialism. That was a project they embarked on in the mid-90s. But they would have to navigate through all this period of rebellions, uprisings, struggles, specific issues that came up, the emergence of threats of military coups as the country became in a very crisis-prone situation, but no one was quite sure where it would end up. And in order to be able to really put forward an alternative project, they had to take into consideration, I would say, argue three things. And again, these will be three things that will be crucial for the masses in Egypt and Tunisia to have a clear understanding of if they want to be able to ensure that their struggle is victorious in the end. I'd say the first thing is a very clear analysis of the balance of forces that each struggle faces. It's all well and good to just say, well, you know, we will fight everyone and everything and not stop till the end. But of course, struggles and battles are not fought generally won like that. They're generally much more strategically fought out, and they need to take into consideration a whole lot of factors when we look at the balance of forces. Of course, one is the international situation. So one on this hand, we see that both Bolivia and its context, where the emergence of other progressive and left governments in the region was obviously a factor that helped their struggle rather than hindered them. It'd be interesting to imagine the Evo Morales government surrounded by a sea, not of, as it is today, of left progressive, different shades of left governments, but rather those same neoliberal governments that were ruling the region back in the 80s and 90s, and what we would have to navigate through. I think secondly is the kind of alliances and the different class forces that are involved. As I said, traditionally sort of socialist, Marxist, we talk about working class revolution, but as I mentioned at the start here in Bolivia, the working class was almost not present, at least the traditional working class. Similarly, you know, we see how the emergence, particularly in Egypt, in my understanding of what I'm seeing today, is very much it's the youth and it's very much unemployed informal workers out on the streets. I have no information about what the organised trade unions are doing, and I'm sure that they're also participating in some form. But how all these different social classes, who each have their own particular interests, their own particular visions of what are what is the key factors facing them, is another crucial element to take into consideration. How to unify these different conflicting forces into a broad enough alliance to be able to defeat the key enemy. Again, within this question will be the military. One of the key factors that the rebellions in Bolivia were unable to deal with directly was the question of the military. At each point when these rebellions occurred, while the military were happy to see the current president go, there was no indication that the military were going to support some new government formed out of the emergent struggles. And if anything, the military was always firm in saying, well, we must support the democratic character. So if it's not going to be the vice president, it must go to elections. That'll be another factor that will need to be taken into consideration. So as I said, the first thing is, I think, the balance of forces. Secondly is also being very clear on who is the key enemy. I mean, there are always many enemies in our struggles. But sometimes we can utilise an enemy on our side for a very short period of time, as long as we're very clear that they're our enemy and that at some later stage they will turn against us. But it's not always necessary to fight on all fronts all of our enemies at one time. And this was, I think, one thing that the group around Evo Morales in Bolivia had very clear. I counterpose this to, for instance, the key figure that I mentioned before, Felipe Quispe. During the period of 2000 up until 2005, Evo Morales was far from being the sort of, the key leader, figurehead of the protest movement. If anything, he was one of maybe a group of 3 or 4. But what differentiated him from particularly someone like Felipe Quispe was that they were very clear on this need to form these broad alliances. So whereas Felipe Quispe's very indigenous discourse would very much put off a lot of the, for instance, white middle class or even mestizo, mixed blood people, we didn't quite identify with sort of radical indigenous sort of, destroy everything that's white and return back to the old, civilization. Counterposed to that, the Evo Morales government was the Evo Morales and the MAS were very clear. Well, we have to be, our key enemy here is imperialism. It's the transnational corporations that are looting our resources. And everyone and anyone who wants to come along with us to recuperate control of our resources, to roll back neoliberalism, to defend indigenous traditions, and that was an important aspect, not hiding that, but making it up front and centre, that we would have to understand that a new Bolivia that was to be built had to accept that the leadership would be under the control of the indigenous people who for so long had been subjugated. That was another key factor. They were able to clearly differentiate who their key enemies were. And I think the third point was that they were able to collect those demands, as I mentioned, that arose from the protests against neoliberalism, and in particular privatisation, recuperate national resources, defend indigenous cultures and traditions, and grabbing those things that small protest movements, medium-sized protest movements, large protest movements had fought on the streets and had convinced the majority of Bolivian society that were necessary, put them forward in a program, which meant that in 2005, Evo Morales would be elected with a record 57% of the vote, something not seen in over half a century in Bolivia. Well, his election, the election of Evo Morales and the movement towards socialism in 2005, represented this emergence of a new bloc, a new power bloc with the indigenous peasant movement in its leadership, and which represented a rise of this sort of broad anti-imperialist indigenous nationalism that emerged in Bolivia over those previous years. And it almost immediately became clear who was on which side of this battle. Even before the elections, the US government was already making it clear that it did not want an Evo Morales government. The corporate media, in its totality, campaigned against the Evo Morales government. The big power elites based in the east of the country in Santa Cruz, mainly involved in gas exploration and in agribusiness, also immediately said that they would oppose any attempts by the government to encroach on their areas. And in fact, once Evo Morales got elected, the first thing they did was to further promote a campaign they were running for autonomy, which essentially what they wanted to have happen was to say, well, the Indians can control the poor west part of the country where there's absolutely nothing, as long as you leave it to us business people who know how to run the agribusiness and the gas, the hydrocarbon sector. There was also a certain resistance from upper middle class white people who were unsure about a new indigenous president. Many of them almost subconsciously feeling that for so long we've kept these people downtrodden. Now they're in government, they might decide to come back and pay their revenge for what we've done to them. So that was an important section that not inherently had to be hostile to the Morales government, but there was the government had to figure out, well, how could we reach out to these sectors and convince them to be part of our project. They also had to convince some of the weak social movements in the east. Many of these protests I mentioned at the start happened in the west of the country. In the east, very few protests actually occurred in the first 5 years of rebellion in Bolivia between 2000 and 2005. And they even had to contend with other sectors who said that the government was not revolutionary or radical at all. They were just wasting our time, and we needed real revolutionaries to take over the government. This was represented by a certain strand in the leadership of the COB, which is the equivalent of the ACTU in Bolivia, the sort of Bolivian Workers' Centre, and its leadership at that time virulently hostile to the Morales government. So that was the broad dynamics of the different forces and how they were reacting to the Morales government. But even the fact that now that Morales had been elected, that the 57% of the country had voted for him, the fact that these protests that had continued to erupt over 5 years had begun to change people's way of thinking. No longer could anyone really run on a platform to say neoliberalism, privatisation and discrimination against indigenous people. It was just no one would support or vote for that. And in fact, one of the funny things was the main opposition party in Bolivia that ran against the Morales in 2005 was a group who named itself Podemos, which is also the name of centre-left parties in Chile and in Venezuela, or at that time the centre-left was now gone to the right. Its main colours were red, and on its red flag it had a 5-pointed star. I mean, any person who would have seen their campaigns and not known who it was would think, well, this is just some radical left-wing group, campaigning with their red flags, and a name that was shared by many other left groups in Latin America. because they knew they couldn't present the old faces, the old parties, the old policies. People just wouldn't accept that. But even despite all these things that the Morales government had on its favour, they were still clear that from the start that having government was not the same as having power. That it was still going to be necessary to confront not just the political power that the opposition had, and it was gradually losing control of, but also the economic and military power that these groups continued to have. And this was only able to be defeated through a massive mobilisation that would occur in September 2008. To set the scene, the opposition at that time had essentially a sort of two wings. The one wing that was in government, that was sort of the weaker wing, didn't have much of a presence in government, was not able to do much there. And the second wing was the prefects, or what we would call here in Australia, premiers based in the eastern states. Now, as a manoeuvre between one wing to the other, they attempted to pass through Parliament a law that Evo Morales had initially put in Parliament eight months before, but the right wing had blocked, which was a recall referendum. All of a sudden, feeling that they could present themselves as the political alternative to Evo Morales on a national level, they said, right, we're going to go to a recall referendum, we're going to approve your law, and you'll have to see if you can win this. And they thought that they would actually win this referendum. They based it on the fact that the government was slowly being weakened and undermined by the continued protests by the right wing. They felt that maybe people had finally decided that we'd gone a bit too far, this is not really going to work, we should put back in the old parties, or at least the old parties in the new guys. Well, instead, the referendum proved the opposite. Evo Morales got 67% of the vote. They increased it from 54 to 67, and triggered off alarm bells, because many felt that now that he had won this massive mandate, that he would go to attack the two wings of the opposition. The first wing had already been discredited because they thought that they could win the recall referendum and lost. But now the prefects were feeling, well, the central government will use this to move against us. So they enacted a plan. They enacted a plan that involved the paramilitaries taking over the streets, the shutting down of all the airports in the eastern part of the country, the occupation of more than 50 different state institutions, the active involvement of some key military figures in the east of the country who had pledged to not use troops to put down the fascist uprising, and culminated in September 11, when a massacre of an estimated 30 to 40 peasants occurred, which just set the whole country alight. It was at that point where the government, the social movements decided this must be crushed. We have tried our best to negotiate, to talk to these people. This is impossible. We must now use all the force of the law against them. Evo Morales and the social movements did two things. Firstly, in the cocoa growing regions in the middle of Bolivia, some 10 to 20,000 peasants gathered there and said, we will march on to the east of the country and we will confront the paramilitaries head on. We are unafraid and we will do this to defend our government. And at the same time, Evo Morales called on the rank and file soldiers in the military to say, who had been begging to be sent in to the east to crush the fascist uprising, said, well, we order you now to go in there and to quell this, to put an end to this. And within 4 days, the right wing had the whole right wing plot to bring down the government had been totally disbanded, and even today the right wing has been unable to recover from that. So they learned that from that it wasn't just enough to have government, that even having government didn't mean you controlled the state, didn't mean you controlled the military, didn't mean you had the economic power to be able to do and carry out some of those policies that you wanted to do. And they also learned that it was only possible with the mass mobilisation and mass participation of the people to be able to make that a reality. There's no way that the fascist uprising would have been defeated simply by passing a law in government or simply by coming out and pleading to these people. It required, before and including that time, the mass mobilisation of the people in order to crush that. And what it meant was that by the time that Evo Morales came up for re-election at the end of last year, once again he would be elected with a record vote in the 64%. He would have now, with a new constitution that had been written up by the Constituent Assembly, which was predominantly Indigenous delegates elected there to rewrite the constitution for the first time, including Indigenous people in the constitution. A broad front that had galvanised in favour and in defence of the government. So even some of these white middle class sections that I mentioned before, who were unsure about the Morales government, were realising they definitely didn't want anything to do with the people who were mobilising paramilitaries out into the street. And so it came over and sided with the Evo Morales government. Sections of the military, particularly the poorer indigenous sections, but even right up to the top ranks, said that only the Morales government could provide some stability for Bolivia. And so by the end of 2009, we had very much a different Bolivia to that which existed in 2000, where we started this sort of story about the protest about in one city about one water transnational raising the rates for for the local communities in that area, and seemingly no enemies, a new Bolivia to be born. Well, we come to 2010, and then we see some interesting things begin to occur. In April, there was clashes between two peasant communities in the north of La Paz. The government pledged to build a citrus processing plant, but the two communities couldn't decide which one should have the processing plant. And unfortunately, because of bad government management of the dispute, it resulted in violent clashes between the two communities. A number of people were killed. In the end, police officers and military had to be mobilised to sort of calm down the two communities. And the government decided that they would just build two citrus processing plants. Each community could have one, and stop fighting and killing each other and blocking one of the main roads leading out of La Paz. Then in May, some sections of the workers' movement came out and protested, claiming that the government had not raised the minimum wage enough. Well, that was quickly diffused through negotiations and discussions with the government. But again, it was one more signal of, well, all of a sudden, these protests are emerging, and they're not in the east, in the rich areas where the old right wing sort of dominated. They're in areas that are very much being important support bases of the government. In June, CIDOB, which is a confederation of indigenous peoples of Bolivia, Bolivia essentially incorporates 36 indigenous nations or ethnic groups. Of those, the two predominant ones are Aymara and Quechua, and the other 34 are grouped in the CIDOB. And they began a march from the east of the country onto the capital against the government on the basis that it wasn't listening to the indigenous communities when it was dealing with the questions of natural resources. In July, in Potosi, a department, or what we call a state, which had voted 80% for Evo Morales, a 2-week general strike shut down the major city there in protest, calling for a number of different issues, ranging from the creation of a new airport in the department to help with tourism, creation of a number of highways, and a cement building factory. Demands that didn't seem to be, particularly sort of revolutionary or radical, but Potosi as a city, one of the most important cities in Bolivia, was shut down for something like 2 weeks. And then in December, I think what surprised many people who've been following Bolivia, what was referred to as the gasolinazo. December 26th, the Vice President came out on TV and gave a very precise explanation of why they were going to remove the subsidies on petrol and diesel prices, saying that, well, this was a tremendous burden on the government budget. It meant that much of this money was being lost to contraband because by subsidising this stuff, which had to be imported because of the Bolivian sort of gas industrialisation program had not been able to fulfil internal demand. We have to import it at world prices, sell it at subsidised prices, and they estimated something between 40 to 60% was then escaping back over the border because people could then sell it over the other side of the border back at international prices and make money off it by contraband. So they decided to eliminate the subsidy, sending gas prices up by about 70%, diesel prices by about 80%. Now you can imagine, of course, the impact that this has, not just on going to fill up your car, but on absolutely everything, because to transport agricultural products from the country to the city requires some form of transportation. The public transport increased their prices by 100%. It's not public, privately owned sort of transport increased their prices by about 100%. And all of a sudden, all these areas that were absolute heartlands of the MUTs, up to and including the cocoa growing regions in the Chapare, began to have roadblocks, something that just was unimaginable. How could it be that the very same people who had given birth to Morales and the movement towards socialism were holding roadblocks against, well, supposedly their government. And many people began to ask, well, is this the end of a cycle? Did we sort of start off with a rebellion that was able to make some important changes, but essentially we were coming back to the start, perhaps in a different starting point, but essentially, or returning to a new normality, where protests would just be the dominant the sort of feature of Bolivian politics, as it had been from the period 2000 to 2005. Well, I think there's a number of factors here, and of course, now these factors that I'll talk about are much more questions that in Egypt and Tunisia are not really on the cards immediately, but will be questions that they'll have to deal with, and things that, ironically, they'll be better off trying to work out some of those issues now rather than leaving it to later. The first thing was, in the context of a defeated and weakened right wing, that broad front that I talked about, that the Morales and the Mas have been able to bring together, no longer face that common enemy. I mean, it's always easier to unite everyone against someone. You've got a clear enemy, a clear purpose. We all go out, we defeat that. But then we all realise, well, we all fought for different reasons and we all want different things out of that. And so part of that is what you start to see now, that the same social movements that were the ones that were responsible for defeating the right wing are now saying, look, we accepted that for your first government, you had to tackle the right wing in the East. And we understand that you put a lot of money and energy into that. But we are the people that voted for you. We are the people that gave birth to you. You're in power because of us. Now we want you to fulfill our demands. And there are many, many demands, as you can imagine, in a country that is estimated to be, when Morales came to power, the second poorest in all of Latin America. Only Haiti, I think, is the only poorer country in Latin America. Many of these social movements that in the periods of intense political struggle were able to go beyond just sectoral and specific demands, actually tackle questions of imperialism, of privatisation, of neoliberalism, have returned to very specific demands, very specific protests. And in some cases, what we're seeing in some of these social movements is a process of what you could refer to as a certain bureaucratisation. Many of those same leaders of peasant organisations are now not just leaders of peasant organisations, but are also ministers, vice ministers, and parliamentarians. And many of them no longer continue to work, sort of carrying out their livelihood. They live off the state in some form or other. This new situation, this new challenge that the Bolivian government faces, I think, points to the fact that they have two roads in front of them. One is, as I said, not many have raised the question of, well, maybe this is just a new normalisation of Bolivia. I mean, now it's different because now people accept that Indigenous people can run the country, can have an Indigenous president. But, that essentially Bolivia, having incorporated the Indigenous majority into public life, just go back to a normality as existed before, and there will be protests and people will demand, and the government will do good policies and bad policies, and there'll be elections. There'll be a new status quo, to put it in some form. Or can this process actually deepen to provide a real radical and revolutionary alternative? I think the main vehicles that will need to be happened through is as the lessons that have been learned, is firstly through that mass participation, only by the people taking that power into their hands. It's not protesting so that a government or a minister or Evo himself can build them a citrus processing plant, or can build them a highway, or can build them an airport. But actually the people building organs of power to determine their own future from the bottom up, to create that new state that is written out in the Constitution but still today remains as mainly just on paper. That will be one particularly important aspect. I think a second particularly important aspect is the necessity to build up a real political organisation that can bring together the leaders of all of these struggles to actually discuss, learn, debate from the lessons that they've gone through the first 5 years of protesting against neoliberal governments, then the next 5 years of the Evo Morales government, and chart out a path for where do we want to go collectively as a people for the next 5 years. Not where do we want to go as individuals, but where can we collectively come up with a plan of how we want to build this new Bolivia that so many people have fought for. And I think the third important aspect will be the extension of that revolution and the need for international solidarity. And I suppose that takes us full circle back to where we started about what's occurring in Tunisia, in Egypt, in the Arab world today. What impact is that going to have on, for instance, the international balance of forces. The US is particularly scared of what would happen in Egypt if that gets out of its control. Imagine how important Egypt has been for the US over the last few decades, for Israel, how important it's been there. We see the developments that are occurring in Lebanon as well. All of these factors don't just impact at a local level, they impact at a regional level, as we've seen it spread across the Arab world, but will inevitably have an impact on the international sphere as well, where US imperialism will have to, at some stage, decide what is it going to do with the with an Arab world in turmoil. It must take a decision one way or the other. Will we fight to the death to defend Mubarak, or will we try and, as they did in Bolivia in the first period, change a little bit in order to change nothing, or will the people, actually convert themselves from a rebellion into a real struggle for power? All of these factors will interplay with themselves, and I think there's no doubt we'll begin to see an even greater interest, particularly under the leadership of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. There has been increasingly greater links between the Arab world and Latin America. There's been a continuous attempt by the Venezuelan government, of course in part of very strategic and simple reason, oil. But beyond that, the necessity to build a broad anti-imperialist front on an international level. Well, as I said, these movements are a long way from where the struggle in Venezuela is today, but doesn't mean it has to take that long for things to change. But what is certain is that these movements that are happening today in the Middle East will have to deal, as the people in Bolivia have been, are, and will continue to deal with, the questions of how to build a new state, how to build a political instrument that can unite these forces, and how together, uniting with other struggles internationally, we can defeat that common enemy, which today, as Evo Morales constantly has said in the UN, in the summits in Cancun, in Copenhagen, that the real enemy of humanity today is capitalism, and we need to fight for a different world today. And I think that's where I'll leave my points for the discussion.